They say empires are built by armies. But what if I told you? This one was built by a banker, an unseen architect of power whose ink, not sword, redrew the map of the world. In the 1700s, while Europe fought over thrones and colonies, a quiet storm brewed in the east. India, golden, opulent, and overflowing with wealth, wasn't just a land of maharajas and palaces. It was the beating heart of the world's economy. And at the center of it all stood one family so rich, so influential, that kings bowed to their ledgers and generals waited for their approval before marching into war. They were the Jagat Seths, a name that meant banker of the world. But they were more than bankers. They were invisible emperors, the financiers behind the throne. Their vaults held more gold than the British East India Company. Their credit flowed through palaces and battlefields alike. Every rebellion, every alliance, every crown in Bengal balanced on their books. With a single stroke of their pen, they could raise a ruler, or erase him from history. But how did a handful of Indian moneylenders come to wield power greater than empires? And how did that same power deliver India into British hands? This is the untold story of the shadow empire that financed the fall of the Mughals and built the British Raj. In the early 18th century, Bengal wasn't chaos. It was cash flow incarnate. Its fertile plains churned out more revenue than all of Britain combined. But while European monarchs squeezed taxes from peasants, Bengal's wealth moved through a different artery, the merchant bankers. These weren't ordinary lenders. They were financial wizards who could transfer fortunes across continents faster than a crown could issue a decree. And among them, one dynasty towered above all, the Jagat Seths. Not a single man, but a lineage of power. They transformed Bengal's booming trade into a private empire of finance, issuing bills of credit long before central banks or the IMF were even imagined. Think of them as the J.P. Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and the Federal Reserve of 18th century India, all fused into one family. They lent to princes, stabilized trade routes from Delhi to Dhaka, and financed entire armies. When Mughal nobles needed soldiers paid or loyally purchased, they didn't go to the emperor, they went to the Seth vaults. Their word was currency, their seal was law, their reach limitless. But power born of gold carries its own poison. When money begins to speak louder than monarchs, the crown starts to serve the coin. By the 1730s, the Mughal Empire was splintering, its emperors mere shadows of their former glory. Bengal's Nawabs ruled like kings, but behind their gilded thrones stood the quiet masters of fortune, the Jagat Seths. They had once financed the empire's rise, and were now funding its slow descent. How could a family of accountants become the architects of empires? The answer lies in one secret deal, and one betrayal that would rewrite the destiny of India. 1757, the glittering city of Murshidabad. Behind its jeweled curtains, a silent conspiracy unfolds. The British East India Company, hungry for power, led by a young, calculating officer named Robert Clive, was done trading spices. They now wanted land, taxes, and control. But there was a problem. They didn't have the funds to wage a war. The Jagat Seths did. Tired of Nawab Siraj-ud-Dowlah's impulsive rule, his reckless spending, his defiance of the merchant elite, the Seths began to see the British not as invaders, but as business partners. Order, profit, predictability. And so, a deal was struck in the shadows. The Seths would bankroll Clive's campaign, supplying gold, provisions, and bribes to the right generals. In return, once the British triumphed, Bengal's treasury would belong to them. It wasn't just a partnership, it was a transaction of destiny. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a balance sheet written in blood. The Battle of Plassey lasted only a few hours. The British didn't win through bravery, they won through betrayal. Siraj's generals, already paid with Seth gold, stood frozen as the British advanced. The Nawab's army crumbled, and by nightfall, Siraj-ud-Dowlah was captured and executed. The East India Company seized Bengal. The Jagat Seths believed they had secured eternal influence. They were wrong, because the British had learned a secret far more powerful than gunpowder. Money conquers faster than war. In just a few years, the British turned on the very financiers who had bankrolled their rise. They drained Bengal's wealth, weaponized its treasury, and expanded their empire across the subcontinent, while the Jagat Seths, once masters of money, vanished into history's shadows. They had financed empires, and unknowingly, their own destruction. They financed an empire, believing they were securing their power. But in truth, they had unleashed a beast of finance that would consume them whole. This isn't just history, it's the story of the greatest wealth transfer ever recorded. The moment when the flow of gold, power, and destiny reversed its course from east to west. When Bengal fell, the world's richest province became the engine room of the British Empire, and the very men who built it, the Jagat Seths, were left standing outside the machine they had created. 1757 was more than a conquest. It was a corporate acquisition. When the East India Company seized Bengal, they didn't just capture land, They captured cash flow. With one royal decree, the Diwani, a trading company became the tax collector of one of Earth's wealthiest regions. But there was a catch. The British knew nothing of India's sophisticated credit networks, the invisible arteries that kept its markets alive. They had the crown's blessing, but not the trust of the merchants. They had the guns, but not the knowledge of the money. So they did what every empire does when confronted with genius it cannot replicate. They absorbed it. The Jagat Seths, once masters of India's financial destiny, were now reduced to accountants in their own kingdom. Independent power replaced by British oversight, freedom replaced by subservience. It was India's first hostile takeover and the most profitable in history. Before 1757, Bengal's fortune stayed home. Its gold and silver moved through cities and villages, funding artisans, temples, and trade. After 1757, that same river of wealth flowed one way, to London. What followed was the slow bleeding of a civilization. Over the next century, Britain extracted what economists now value at $45 trillion, an ocean of stolen prosperity. That wealth built the factories of Manchester. It armed the Royal Navy. It bankrolled Britain's rise to global dominance. India didn't just lose its riches. It became the collateral that financed the world's first industrial superpower. And as the British built their empire, they dismantled India's. The old financial web, the Jagat Seths, the Mawaris, the Banias, was systematically erased. The East India Company replaced centuries of indigenous credit with its own monopolized system of currency and loans. Audits turned into accusations, partnerships into prison sentences. And one by one, the great Indian financiers fell. By the 1770s, the Jagat Seths, once richer than the Bank of England, were bankrupt. Their houses looted, their influence gone. The irony? The British didn't invent the system that made them powerful. They simply perfected the Indian one and redirected it outward, transforming Bengal's wealth into the fuel of the Industrial Revolution. If India had remained financially independent, its economy might have rivaled any modern superpower. But history had already chosen its path. Britain didn't fund its empire. India did. The taxes squeezed from Bengal became the seed money for Britain's global ambitions. Every musket fired in Europe, every warship that set sail under the Union Jack, every cannon cast for Napoleon's defeat, all carried the invisible stamp, paid by India. Cotton from Indian fields fed the mills of Manchester. Finished cloth sailed back to India, sold at 10 times the price. It was a perfect loop of exploitation. Indian money paid for British soldiers. British soldiers protected British trade. British trade ensured more Indian taxes could be collected. An elegant, merciless machine of empire, powered by the very colony it consumed. The Jagat Seths may have vanished, but their legacy lived on, woven into the DNA of British capitalism itself. Their decentralized web of credit became the model for colonial finance. The system that once made Bengal the envy of Asia now built London's empire of gold. And the ultimate irony? The techniques that made Britain's financial revolution so admired, its accounting, banking, and credit systems, had existed in India centuries earlier. But the wheel of fortune never stops turning. When India's wealth stopped flowing, Britain's empire began to crack. By the mid-1800s, the East India Company, once the world's most powerful corporation, collapsed under the weight of its own greed. The British Crown took direct control, but the magic had faded. Without India's endless surpluses, the empire's costs outpaced its gains. War, infrastructure, administration, all drained more than they earned. By 1947, as the Union Jack lowered over Delhi, Britain's national debt had soared to over 200% of its GDP. The empire that had once ruled half the world died the same way the Mughals had, drowned in debt, strangled by the very system it created. Empires don't collapse because of armies. They collapse because of accounts. For the Mughals, the power lay with the Jagat Seths. For the British, it shifted to the bond markets and later to the dollar. History doesn't just repeat, it compounds. The saga of the Jagat Seths isn't merely about a family's rise and ruin. It's a mirror reflecting every empire's illusion of permanence. Because power may command the battlefield, but money commands time itself.